Over to Paul Berry.
All right, thank you, Farrell. Good afternoon, everybody. Like Farrell said, my name is Paul Berry. I live in Wake Forest, North Carolina, here on the East Coast. Thank you for joining. I appreciate it. Looking forward to spend the next 60 minutes or so. So like he said, we're going to talk about self-checkout best practices along with some new loss prevention solutions that we've recently announced. Those of you that haven't heard from me before, part of my responsibility really is working with retailers coast to coast in the US. Mainly, the big focus is really self-service, right? What can you do as a retailer to drive more business in your stores by leveraging self-service? Today's webinar is not so much about why SCO, it's more about now that you have self-checkout, how do you make sure you're doing the right things to get the success you need from them, getting the right ROI? So that's kind of what I'm going to cover today. And like Farrell said, next month we'll be talking about why self-checkout. So those of you that have purchased Toshiba self-checkout or products, thank you. We appreciate your business. And hopefully as we get done with this, you'll see some new products that we're going to come out with here or that we've already come out with. So with that, I'm going to get off video since I do talk with my hands, and we'll kind of dive into the presentation. So what are we going to talk about? We're going to talk about first, before we get into self-checkout, some lessons learned, right? Why are we doing it, number one, but what are some of the lessons that have been learned over the last year or two that we're starting to see the, I would say, negative impact on what happened when you go too far with self-checkout, right? Then we're going to talk about best practices, obviously, but more of the best of best practices. Then we're going to talk about loss prevention, and then I'll leave time for Q&A. Before I dive in, just to understand, what I'm going to talk about from a best practice perspective is more of a high-level view of best practices. If you haven't gone through a full-blown 60 to 90-minute presentation on strictly best practices, I encourage you to get with STCR and get that scheduled if you already have self-checkout, because I'm only kind of hitting the icing when it comes to best practices on the cake, but you really need to find out more information, get some training material as we go through it. So that's kind of what the agenda is. So let's kind of dive in here. So we know, based on history, right, about 94% of grocers today have either implemented self-checkout, are in the process of doing it, or are taking a serious look at doing it. That leaves about 6% of retailers today that are not interested in self-service from a grocery perspective. And I always like to say, those that are on the 6% path, they need more education, because they still think that self-service means no service. And we know that's not true if you do it correctly with best practices. We also know that self-checkout really gives your shoppers control of the transaction, a private checkout experience, give them a choice of what way they want to check out within your store. So let them choose either self-service or a regular lane. But more importantly, as your front end gets busy during peak times, right? How do you prevent your store operations from getting slammed in there, right? So those are key areas to think about. And then allowing self-checkout to really absorb some of that spikes when it happens. And your goal here is to reduce queue times without having to increase your labor on the front end. But more importantly, as you'll learn when I talk about self-checkout in general, you're going to save labor, but if you can redeploy that labor elsewhere in the store to drive higher sales, you're gonna love those results. So we also know from a self-checkout perspective, customers think it's faster, right? Now we know a cashier is faster than a shopper, right? But at the end of the day, when you have one line going into self-checkout and 4 ways to get out, it's going to seem to the shopper that, hey, I can get in and get out quicker if I use self-checkout. So that's going to drive up your utilization with those self-checkout lanes. So that's why self-checkout really appears to be faster from a grocer. So what are the trends that we've seen over the last couple of years? We've seen retailers that have originally installed 4, maybe like yourself, they're moving to 6 lanes or moving to 8 lanes, right? We've seen some retailers go to the extreme, right? We've all seen it in the news. They're doing 80% self-checkouts in the store. They're driving 80% of their transactions through that self-checkout. We're starting to see that more and more again, right? So if you've looked at any of the trade rags over the last couple of years, we have Walmart doing 100% self-checkout only. And they're having, clerks obviously watch those self-checkouts. We've seen the same thing from Albertsons. They've announced they're doing pilots with 100% self-checkouts. There's a Harris Teeter store here in Charlotte, North Carolina that went to 100% self-checkout, right? So we're seeing a lot of these larger chains really go to the extreme, and then we're hit with this, right? I think you all have seen in the last 6 to 12 months, right? You know, Walmart, Costco, and Wegmans, they're ripping out self-checkouts. Now, we know that's not true. They're taking a step back and reevaluating what they've done, obviously, right? But we see this every day, right? Every week, I seem to get an article from somebody saying, you know, self-checkout, there people are ripping them out because of shrink and all that. Well, you know what? When you start to get greedy from a self-checkout perspective and you start to implement 80 to 100% self-checkout, you're going to drive shrink. And if you turn off security at the self-checkout, you're going to drive shrink. So the real question that you have to think about as a retailer is, how do you provide that self-service environment without going to the extreme and causing yourself more headaches on the front end due to shrink and things like that? So go back to the core values, right? You want to provide your shoppers a choice and control. So what choice means is you're giving them the option of which way to check out. So don't go overboard on your self-checkouts. 50-50 would be the max I would recommend you go, depending on your store layout. If you start going more than 50% self-checkout, I think you're going to start to irritate some of your shoppers there. So that's kind of the preamble to what we're going to talk about. So where does best practices come from? Just to kind of rewind a little bit. It comes from you. It comes from you as the retailer, right? We've had many, many years of self-checkout experience in the industry. And we talk to our customers, we talk to our business partners, and we ask them, hey, what works, what doesn't work? What advice would you give to a new retailer that's thinking about self-checkout? And this is where this information came from. It didn't come from a lab somewhere. It came from real use cases out there saying, okay, how do you provide self-service with good customer service, right? How do you do it right way? What's the wrong way? All that good stuff. And this is kind of what we compiled. So we know based on experience, what influences the shopping experience is really three main thrusters, right? Employees inviting shoppers to use the self-checkout lanes. I didn't say just shopper assistant, I said employees, so any employee in the store. The experience while the shopper's using the machine, are they getting stuck? Are they getting frustrated? Managing the front end queues. So when regular full service lanes are backed up, is somebody suggesting to shoppers, hey, would you like to use self-checkout, right? We know demographic plays a role. We know placement plays a role. Signage plays a role. They all play a small piece of it, and they all affect the other three quadrants. But you really got to focus your time on those three quadrants that you see on the screen. Because as your shopper enters that area, right, there's hardware, there's software to deal with, there's tools and policies, and they're going to say, you know what? Did I get through the transaction without any issue? When I got stuck, how fast did I get help? Were there a lot of interventions that caused the lane to stop? And did I get help when I needed it, right? And they're going to say, you know what? Was it easy and comfortable? How often did I get stopped and how fast did I get help? We know there's the 20-second rule. If the shopper doesn't get help within 20 seconds of an intervention occurring, what are they going to do? They're either going to pick up their product, go to another self-checkout lane. They're going to pick up their product, go to a regular lane. They're going to abandon the transaction altogether, or worst case, they're going to pick up the product and walk out the door, right? So you got to make sure that your shopper assistant is there to assist the shopper at all times. So those of you that remember the Dave Letterman show on the top 10 list, we have a top 10 list for self-checkout. And we're going to cover each one of these, and I'm going to show you how they correlate to best practices. So as we dive in, let's go with number one, right? So the first thing is selecting the right shopper assistant. What is a shopper assistant? A shopper assistant is a person that's assigned to the self-checkout lanes 100% of the time while those lanes are open. Every retailer that's tried to circumvent having somebody manage those self-checkout lanes full-time fails miserably, and their shrink goes through the roof. And it doesn't mean the shopper assistant is hiding behind a podium like we see at some retailers, right? You want that shopper assistant working with the shoppers. They're your first line of defense, right? They're there to supervise the lane. They're there to help direct traffic to the lane. Each shopper assistant's going to have a shopper assistant ID card that they use to scan to get into the lane, declare intervention. So you never let that card be shared with any other employee, because by having one card per employee, you're able to look at the audit trail of what that shopper assistant did when they scanned their card to declare intervention, right? But they're there to really monitor the lighting, the transaction awareness lights, the customer's body language when they're getting frustrated, listen to the audio prompts from the SCO lane. But the first part of loss prevention at self-checkout is the shopper assistant making eye contact with every shopper that enters in that courtyard area and greeting that shopper with a simple, hi, my name is Paul. Let me know if you have any questions. I'll be right over here. By that shopper assistant making eye contact, right, talking to the shopper, the chances of that shopper trying to steal from you at self-checkout when somebody's there watching, when you have cameras, hopefully, the odds are slim to none. If they're going to steal, they're probably going to steal in the aisle. So make sure that shopper assistant is doing their job, right? Again, greet everyone that comes in there, encourage them how to use it. If they're a new user to your store, just because they know how to use self-checkout somewhere else doesn't imply they know how to use yours in your store. Answer questions, remove fear, right? Educate when an intervention occurs. That means they have to walk over to the lane, declare the intervention versus doing it remotely, and educate the shopper. By the way, you can't put your purse or your umbrella in the bagging area, and here's the reason why, right? They got to manage that traffic flow, and again, watch that body language. When they're not busy, that's when they need to engage more with the shopper, right? Maybe there's an elderly shopper. They can show them how to scan items, get that shopper comfortable with the self-checkout, how it works. And probably by the third or fourth time, that shopper's going to say, you know what, I got it. Let me handle it, right? When they're not busy, they need to be cleaning the lane. It's a customer-facing device, right? Wiping the screen down, the scanner scale, and explaining what the lighting does. You know, that LED lighting on the lane does have a reason for being there, and they can explain what all that is. So here's kind of a quick checklist. I'm not going to get into all these different things. I really cover these in detail when I do full-blown best practices, but just some common sense things. You got to have somebody there all the time. They got to be there to help the shopper. They got to be committed to the job, right? Again, you'll get a copy of this presentation from Farrell if you request it. So these are just some of the things that the shopper assistant should do, kind of some of their role and responsibilities. Again, we get into more of these during the full-blown presentation of self-checkout best practices. So what's the next one? Management not embracing SCO, self-checkout, right? So let's face it, right? You're making a big investment into self-checkout. So there's three key components to being successful. One is effective planning. Two is committing to best practices. And three, support from all levels of management. I always like to tell a retailer, if you have one person in a leadership role within your company that is negative about self-checkout, whether it's on the operations side, the loss prevention side, even at the store side, it's going to be like a cancer and it's going to destroy the whole project and you're not going to succeed, right? So you got to get all level of management bought into why we're doing it, right? Get them engaged early. Make sure the store's early. Make sure you got the messaging to the store and why we're doing it, right? You need to be looking at reporting, and we'll talk about that to make sure that you're hitting on all cylinders when it comes to success at the self-checkout. And I always like to recommend assigning an advocate at every store, okay? And the reason for that is you'd be surprised if you spend 10, 15 minutes talking to a shopper assistant on what you'll glean from talking to that shopper assistant on what's going on at those SCO lanes, right? And most retailers don't do it. And then they wonder why shoppers get frustrated is because you're never fine tuning the operation at the self-checkout. So number one is your store ready, right? Do all employees know why you're implementing SCO? I say all is in capital. Here's a reason why. I'll give you an example. I was at a store install, this was a couple of years ago up in Minnesota, and it was great. A shopper walked by and asked a front-end person, wasn't a shopper assistant, wasn't a manager, just an employee, those self-checkouts are taking jobs, aren't they? Well, guess what? That employee turned to that customer and said, sir, did you not see the help wanted sign in the window? We cannot find help. We cannot find labor. Would you like an application? So the point here is that employee in the store knew how to address that customer's concern. What happens if you have an employee helping a shopper out to the car with their bags and that shopper turns to that employee says, those self-checkouts are taking jobs, aren't they? Again, that employee needs to be able to address it. So make sure every employee understands why you're doing self-checkout and they're positive about it if you want your results to be favorable, right? Make sure management is there to address any employee concerns, right? Does the employee think their jobs are being threatened if you're doing self-checkout? Make sure you communicate that early. Have you gone through the store and made sure there's no red flags? What's a red flag? Anything that won't scan at the self-checkout, pretty much, right? Is that going to cause complication at the self-checkout? Do all employees know what their roles are, right? Do they know how to communicate the benefits of SCO? And here's the biggest one that I see a retailer do is you do a great job of learning and implementing best practices at your first store. But if you have more than one store, what you end up doing is you order self-checkouts for the next store and the next store. You send the new shopper assistant from store B to store A, the first store, to get trained, but nobody else in the second and third and fourth store get trained. So when shoppers start asking your employees questions about self-checkout, they can't answer because they've never been trained. So the message here is this: make sure whatever training you did on best practices for the first store is implemented in the second and third store. So that's really digging deep in the best practices, adding it to your training material, working with STCR to get educated on it, to make sure everybody's on the same page. All right, so let's keep going. Not removing express lanes, keeping point of sale lanes open with no lines forming. We'll explain that, right? Opening POS lanes away from self-checkout lanes. Again, you got some queuing issues there. Locating lanes at the far end, close to exit doors, not selecting the right type of self-checkout. And then obviously the shopper assistant not performing queue management. So what's the best layout? If you ask me, Paul, where should these self-checkouts go? I'm always going to default to the center of the front end. So whether you have 4 lanes, 6 lanes, 10 lanes, 12 lanes, the best location to put them is in the center if you can. So take out the center 2 or 3 POS lanes, plop in 4 or 6 self-checkout lanes. That is the best place to put them for queue management. And I'll explain that to you here in a second, right? Make sure it's visible to shoppers as they come through there, right? You got to eliminate express lanes. Express lanes compete with self-checkout. The only exception to that rule is maybe the customer service counter. You want to have an express lane there, that's fine. But if you keep self-checkout lanes open, you're gonna have a challenge there with express lanes at self-checkout, right? So put them in the center if you can. Keep them away from exit doors. Do not put them close to exit door for 2 reasons. 1, loss prevention reasons. 2, if you have any wind coming from the outside, it's going to cause havoc on the weight security scale. Same thing with HVAC vents, right? HVAC vents blowing from up above. It's going to cause problems with your lanes. Place merchandise racks around the lanes for impulse items. Low merchandise racks. Also have low merchandise racks forming one line going in, right? So again, use those to your advantage. Why do I say low merchandise racks? A, you want your customers to be able to see over them to see if there's availability to go use the self-checkout lanes. B, you want employees to be able to see over them to see what's going on at self-checkout. And then the last item really is never share a self-checkout lane with anything else on the circuit, i.e. a cooler, a space heater. You'd be surprised of what retailers do, and then they wonder why they're having issues with the self-checkout is you're sharing the circuit with other devices within the store. So here's a perfect layout. Again, if you need help with the layout, STCR will help you with that. But basically, you want to have right spacing. You don't want to play bumper carts because lanes are too close together. If you can put them in a courtyard environment where they're facing each other with a shopper assistant in the center watching them, whether they're placed like this or they're turned 90 degrees, it doesn't matter. But the point here is make sure there's one way to get in and one way to get out. If you can put them in the center, put them in the center. If you have to put them on the end, put them on the end where they'll see self-checkout first when they're done shopping, which is usually on the opposite side of the exit doors, right? That's where you normally put them. But let's talk about queue management, right? So what is queue management? So if you have your lanes in the center, like I always recommend in a courtyard environment, what happens is this: when you start opening point of sale lanes, you want to open them next to self-checkout. And this is probably the biggest mistake retailers make, is they open them a couple lanes away from self-checkout, which is a big no-no. You want to open them next to self-checkout first, and you want lines to form. What drives utilization is lines forming at regular lanes. So in the example I'm showing you here, you need to open, let's say, lane 3 first, and then lane 4, then lane 2, then lane 5. That way, as lines are forming, the shopper assistant, if they're doing their job and they have availability at self-checkout, they're going to invite shoppers to come and use self-checkout and bust down those lines. If you open lanes 1 or 6 first, and lines form there, there's no way for those shoppers to see there's open spaces at self-checkout, nor is a shopper assistant supposed to leave their post to go grab somebody, right? So again, make sure you're doing that. Also make sure that you're closing POS lanes when you're not busy. That way, again, it'll encourage shoppers to use self-checkout as well. Here's an example of a courtyard layout. Again, this was a picture after the install was done. I love it because it's right in front of customer service in the center of the store. What's missing from this picture is merchandise racks forming one line to go in and merchandise racks around the lanes. But other from that, it's a great layout in a courtyard environment in a good obvious spot where it's being watched by a lot of store employees. All right, how about not reviewing BOSS reports, right? And speaking to the shopper assistant for continuous improvements. So what's the BOSS? The BOSS is the back office system server. Let me make a comment here. When I come out and see you as a retailer, what I always like to do is maybe visit the store the day before and spend about 30 minutes watching the operation of self-checkout. And usually 9 times out of 10, I can walk away with 10 items that you're not doing from a best practice perspective, and then I document those and I share them with the retailer the next day on what they can do to improve. But my point here is this: even if you're not willing to have somebody go do that every single month in a store to view what's going on, at least have somebody talking to the shopper assistants to get their opinion of what's going on and where things are challenged at the self-checkout. So from a back office system server, what is it? It's a machine that either sits in your store or at your headquarter location, and it's there with reporting information. It's your weight security database is there, your quick item lookup is managed there, your shopper assistant ID cards are there. But the most important thing about the BOSS is the reporting. If I were to take a poll on this call and ask you, how many of you are looking at the BOSS reports? I bet you any amount of money is less than 5%. And I like to say running self-checkout without looking at your reports is like flying a 747 without looking at instruments. At the end of the day, you're probably not going to do well, right? So my point here is you probably wouldn't run your store without looking at sales data, right, or inventory numbers. Well, it's hard to run a successful self-checkout implementation without looking at the reports, because how else are you going to find out how many interventions you're having on each lane? What type of intervention are you having? Is there a problem with the label packaging on, the packaging itself, right? Is there label issues where it's not scanning? Is a machine having an issue, right? What's causing friction at the lane? By looking at the BOSS reports, it's going to tell you what the challenges are. It's going to show you the not on files. It's going to show you what the average basket size is. It's going to give you all the data you want, but just as important, it's going to help you with a forensic analysis to find out if a shopper assistant is doing no good, right? Are they doing something at the self-checkout to cheat the system the same way your cashier's doing at the regular lane, right? I know they can't do sweethearting because of the weight security, but depending on their authorization on what they can do, you want to make sure the shopper assistant's doing their job as well. So your goal is, right, if you're doing the right thing here at self-checkout, you want at least 35% of your transactions, not the revenue amount, but the transactions going through self-checkout, a minimum of 35%. I've seen stores as high as 50, but that's the ultimate goal. We talked a little bit about red flags before. What is a red flag? Anything that's going to slow the transaction down, anything that's going to stop the transaction. So again, barcodes missing, multiple barcodes, things like that. How about not utilizing the lane security? This is the greatest one, right? So again, how does self-checkout work? What's part of the security? Part of it is the weight security. So it learns the weight of your products. It stores that in the database. And as people are buying and scanning those products, if it doesn't fall within the weight range, it's going to cause an intervention. But we also know that if the customer causes an intervention on their own, maybe they put their umbrella in the bagging area, as long as they remove it, it's not going to stop the lane, right? So all of your lanes will contribute to that weight database, right? You can also limit the PLU usage. I've had some retailers turn off weight security, and then they wonder why they're having a shrink problem. Well, I'm sorry, when you're not weighing anything, it doesn't matter what they scan, kind of like the Walmart does. They can get out of the door with anything, right? With anything they want to. So you got to make sure you turn on that weight security and keep it on. Organics. I get a lot of questions about organics. How do I make sure I'm not getting ripped off on organics? Well, I'm going to show you a couple things later on in the presentation, but at a minimum, right, in your quick lookup chart, in your flip chart, make sure that you're having the organic product show up next to the non-organic product. Worst case, make sure the organic is in red so they can see it on the actual screen, right? I would have a tab at the top named organic. So now I've had it on the main screen. I have organic tab so they can find organics with the tab. I would also have a category called organic. So now you're giving that shopper 3 areas to find organics. If you really want to get creative, I had a couple retailers come up with an organic logo. And they not only put the organic logo on the organic produce, but they also put it on the button itself on the screen. So again, you got to do everything you can to allow that shopper to have the benefit of the doubt for selecting the right products. And we've learned over time, most shoppers are going to be honest, right? So give them the benefit of the doubt of picking the right product versus saying, you know what, I did my best to find it, I couldn't find it, so I picked the next best one, right? So give them that option to go make that right choice. Make sure that for type 2 barcodes, again, these are variable weight items. By default, it will scan the barcode and take the price from the barcode, and it won't care about the weight. If you have this feature turned on, and STCR can educate you on how to do this, you can either feed the self-checkout your scale file or go back to the point of sale to get the price per pound. And it will force the shopper to put the item on the scanner scale to weigh it, and it'll compare what's in the label and do the calculation itself. That way for type 2 products, you make sure you're getting what you're selling type thing. All right, with that, I'm going to move from the best of best practices in the loss prevention. So Toshiba's been hard at work working on loss prevention, and we've spent many years working on this, and we have a really, really slick roadmap. I'm not going to get into everything right now, but these are some of the items that we have already released. And these are some of the items that we're working on to release here in the future. So I'm going to start off with this. So here's a typical System 7 self-checkout lane. And if you look at what we're doing from a loss prevention perspective, we have a new product called Loss Prevention with Produce Recognition. So this is where we're going to recognize the produce item if we can, and we're going to display it on the screen. We just announced a new overhead camera, which is looking down onto the scanner scale, looking at the shopper's behavior as they're scanning products or fake scanning products. We'll cover a little bit of that. Our goal is to integrate these two cameras together to be able to give you more insight into what's going on at the SCO lane. We're also looking at doing possibly a bottom of the basket, not so much like a lane hawk where we're going to recognize the product and add it to the transaction, more of, you know, shopper, you have something down there at the bottom of the basket, please acknowledge what it is and remove it, right? Type thing, kind of stop the transaction there. And then we're also looking at adding weight security to the weight security scale, a camera. So our goal is to really tie all those together, right, to help with loss prevention. Today, we also have a personal video monitor that you can mount above the display, which will show the shopper on the display. It's some extra software that you would purchase, but I know some retailers like to have the shopper being seen while they're shopping. So let's talk about produce recognition. That's the first one we'll talk about. So what's the challenge that we have at the self-checkout if you think about it? Well, how about products that are non-scannable? So if you don't have a scannable barcode, what does that mean? Well, the shopper needs to either type in a PLU, right, or go through a bunch of pages to trying to find the produce item. So if there was a way to recognize the product for the shopper, that might speed up the transaction, right? Or better yet, shrink, right? We know there's scanning errors. We know they're typing in the wrong PLU. Well, if there's a way to solve that, maybe you can save on some shrink there, right? So what we did with produce recognition is we decided to come up with a solution, right, that's really going to improve the shopping experience, which is really going to improve the adoption of SCO. Think about a customer that has a lot of produce items. Their first reasoning for not wanting to use self-checkout is, I'm going to get stuck because I have produce items. I won't be able to find it. It doesn't have a PLU. So those are some of the things we're trying to minimize with produce recognition, which is really going to reduce the shrink and improve the accuracy. So here's the way the system works. We have a AI camera, so it's a edge camera, so all the brains are inside the actual camera, and that camera is pointing down onto the scanner scale. And through AI technology, we're taking an image of that product, we're modeling it, we're putting it into the cloud, into a database, and we're trying our best to recognize what that product is, right, and give them selections on the screen. I'll show you an actual video of this. So the good news is this, and it's very different than the competition, is our camera has all the logic and brains built into it. We don't have to have, 20 servers in the back of the store to analyze the data. We do it right there in the camera, including the imagery in the camera. So the latency is not there like it would be with the competitor. So it's very quick as far as recognizing the product. So what happens is this: shopper comes up, puts their produce item on the scanner scale. It triggers the camera to go take a look at the produce. Retail Vision kicks in and analyzes it. Our check software displays maybe 3 or 4 items on the screen that look like that item. The shopper will select it, and then they're done. So in the background, we're recording everything the shopper did during that produce recognition lookup. what item they picked, what item was on the screen. If it wasn't on the screen, it's collecting all that telemetry data. It's sending it up to the cloud. Our data scientists are analyzing all that. And what we're doing about 3 to 4 times a year is we're sending down new produce models to every customer to add new produce items, to clean up what's going on, to streamline the process, to make it even better. So it's constantly learning through the AI technology. So I'm going to show you a quick video to let me catch my breath, and this will show you a good idea of the way produce recognition works with our solution. So to kind of set this up is the screen on the left is the actual self-checkout screen. The camera is right here on the left-hand side of the display, pointing down onto the scanner scale. So I'm going to let this run.
Today we're going to show you the Toshiba Produce Recognition Solution. For the demo, we're running a System 7 unit that's running our check software, along with a Toshiba Edge camera that's actually doing the computer vision algorithms on the camera itself. Let's get started. In order to enter produce using self-checkout, again, you indicate that you're entering produce. You put your item on the scale. The system recognizes the item. For items that have both organic and non-organic items, both are shown for the shopper to choose. Here, we'll select our bananas, add them to the cart. The solution also works with bags. So here we have an avocado, put in a black bag, select produce recognition. The item gets recognized. We add it to our cart. We also recognize items that are in a reusable bag. So here we have oranges, put them on the scale, request the system to identify them, and it does identify the items. So the other feature of the solution is allowing the shopper to correct their own mistakes that they could have inadvertently made while shopping. So here, we'll put garlic on the scale, allow the system to identify it. Let's assume the shopper says they don't want to use that item, they want to key the PLU in themselves. They inadvertently enter the wrong item number. So what the system will do will show them exactly what the camera observes, the item they entered, and what the system selects as the actual item on the scale. Here, the shopper can easily correct their mistake and enter the correct item. Next, loss prevention in terms of customers that are not making accidental mistakes. In this example, they're trying to purchase a steak for a banana. They put the steak on the scale. Enter the produce. The system does not recognize the item, so the shopper can key in their own item number. So here we're keying in bananas. The system shows what was actually on the scale, the item that the shopper entered, so they know that they've been caught. They can continue down this path and say they want to select the bananas anyway. Once they put the item in the bag, the shopper assistant is called over to be able to address the situation. Once they scan their shopper assistant card, we show the item image of the steak. We show that the shopper entered the banana, so the shopper assistant can void the item at this point in time to continue the transaction. That's Toshiba's produce recognition solution.
All right, hopefully that kind of gave you an idea of what we're doing with Produce Rec. Again, we're very excited about the solution, and as I speak, there's several retailers that are embracing and rolling the new product out. So let's go one step further. So what happens if you're running our ACE product on our point of sale system at the front end lane? Can you do the same? Absolutely. So if you're running our ACE product from STCR today and you have a DataLogic 9800i, the same camera that we would mount in the self-checkout is the same camera we would mount on the top-down imager of the DataLogic scanner pointing down at that scanner scale. So your cashiers will now have the same ability that your shoppers did at the self-checkout to be able to leverage produce recognition. Those of you that are running Lock SMS, it's part of the roadmap. Once we release some code that Lock would have to take advantage of, but it is part of our roadmap to allow non-Toshiba point of sale applications to leverage it as well. That's kind of where we're going. And what's the benefit of it? I'm not going to get too much into detail about this chart, but on the left-hand side kind of shows the time lapse required if a cashier is pulling it from memory, asking another cashier, looking up a UPC number versus just letting the AI technology, computer vision find it themselves on average about three and a half seconds to find it. So again, it's really going to help your cashier as well pick produce items at the regular front end lane. So let's talk about the latest in our security suite offering, and that is the top-down reader, right? So a top-down imager, it works on both our System 6 and System 7 self-checkouts. System 6 was our previous generation. So what is this all about? So how about a downward view of what's going on at the self-checkout? So this is a camera, again, an edge camera, a smart camera that gets mounted on top of the transaction awareness light, and it's pointing down onto the scanner scale area. And if you look at this chart, there's a couple scan zones that it's trying to read and recognize. And what it's trying to figure out is, as the shopper is scanning items, are they trying to fake the system out and maybe cover the barcode of the product, or maybe stack two products on top of one another, scanning the cheaper barcode? And as they're going past the scanner scale, we call it a ghost scan, if they don't actually scan the product, right? So they're kind of faking the system out. So we're releasing the top-down view in multiple phases. So I'm going to show you kind of the first use case that we just released. And you're actually going to see the shopper. This is at a live store. This shopper, in my opinion, has no idea that when they scanned the product, it didn't register for whatever reason it was, right? It just didn't read the barcode, and they just kept on scanning. Now, it's a difficult video to see because you can't really see the display screen on the self-checkout, but what's going to happen is the self-checkout's going to prompt them, like you see on the right-hand side of the screen, and show them a replay of the video, basically telling the shopper, this item was not scanned. Did you mean to scan it? And that's going to stop the transaction. So we're going to let this play, and you'll kind of see what's going on. So this is the product that really didn't get scanned, and the system's finally going to stop, and it's going to go back and replay it, and then the shopper's kind of confused, saying, what just happened, right? So you're able to see that video on the screen of what happened. So that's kind of, is it intentional or was it not? To me, that was not intentional. Now, if you look at this video, this is one of our proof of concept videos. If you see that green circle, you're going to see where it says miss scan. So this is a shopper that you're going to see that really intentionally decided not to scan the item as they're looking around to see if anybody's watching. So let's let this video play. Grabs the item out of the cart, looks around, nobody's looking. I'm going to pretend I scanned it. Now you see miss scan in that green circle. So this is where it's legitimately catching a shopper from trying to steal from you at the self-checkout lane. So that use case is available today. Again, that's looking down at the self-checkout and watching the shopper's behavior. Some other items that we're currently working on, this is kind of our future use cases, is what happens if the shopper takes it from their cart and bypasses this scanner altogether and goes right to the bag? Right. So now the next use cases that we'll work on is not just are we doing 1 and 2 scan zones above the scanner scale, but we're looking in front of the self-checkout lane as well. So we'll look at the lady on the left. She's scanning items. You know what? I'm going to try to save some money. I'm just going to put these right in my bag. Right now, you're going to see miss scan up in that green circle. So if you look at this one on the right, this is probably my favorite one here. This one wants to get the hat for free, takes the hat out of the cart, decides to wear it instead, and now you see miss scan up in that area. So those are just some of the things that we're working on in the lab. Hopefully we'll get these released sooner versus later, but these are future use cases that we're looking at. All right, let's keep on going here. In addition to that, what you can do today also is this. So we talked a little bit about that PVM camera that would mount on top of the display, showing the shopper. Again, this is extra software you would have to purchase, but it'll show the shopper on the display. Another option is in the center and on the right-hand side. So this is really just taking a third-party video camera that STCR can hook you up with that has a built-in camera, and you're actually showing the shopper, scanning at the self-checkout. So at a minimum, right, you need to have something showing the shopper they're being watched, whether you're showing it on the touch screen on the skull lane, whether you're showing it on this monitor that's mounted to the transaction awareness light, whether you have a flat screen TV in the self-checkout area showing shoppers in that area. You want them to be known that they're being watched, and that's kind of the message I'm trying to deliver there. Other things you can do with loss prevention at the self-checkout lanes, determine whether you want employees to use them. They know how they work, right? So you got to be careful of that. Maybe have an anonymous hotline, have boundaries, again, one way in, one way out, low merchandise racks, right? Use your existing camera systems like we just talked about. And again, make sure that shopper assistant card is assigned to each shopper assistant only. It's not shared. Maybe it's turned in at the end of the shift. And again, utilizing those reports, you'll be able to see what those shopper assistants are doing when they scan their cards. Keep in mind, every shopper assistant, you can have, I think, 9 different levels of authorization to do different things. So don't just let any shopper assistant do anything they want to at the SCO line. Make sure based on their authorization, they can do certain things. And here's my last chart, right? So, you may ask, okay, what's the feedback from other retailers to retailers that maybe haven't done self-checkout before? Well, A is follow best practices, right? We've been spending about 45 minutes talking about that, right? Your success is the shopper assistant. If you have a shopper assistant that doesn't know how to greet shoppers, that is not Johnny on the spot, right? They're sitting in the corner checking their Facebook status on their phone. You got the wrong shopper assistant. Go move them elsewhere in the store. People say, Paul, I want to put my best cashier there. You know what? Let your best cashier be your best cashier. Put the person that can multitask and has a good personality. That's the person you want at self-checkout, somebody that can really engage with your shoppers, because that's your customer service when it comes to self-service, right? Interventions are key. Make sure there's somebody there to help them. Make sure you're minimizing the interventions by looking at your boss reports. Again, don't force shoppers to use them. Like a lot of home improvement stores, give them the option to use them, right? So you got to have regular lanes open as well. Be careful on taking too much labor out of the front end. Let usage develop, right? Great customer service acts as a theft deterrent. We talked about that. Make sure the shopper assistant's engaging, right? Thieves don't want to be talked to. Make sure self-checkout is accepted by all your employees, right? You got to get buy-in at all levels. We talked about that. And really don't base your entire business case just on labor savings, right? It's all about giving your shoppers a choice. And that's the key message here. So, Farrell, with that, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Paul. That was great. Thanks for the best practices overview.
Sure.
So I'm going to move right into some questions that have come in. Also, for all of you on the call, feel free to submit your questions in the Q&A section below. And we'll be able to cover those over the next 10 to 15 minutes as we close out the hour. So Paul, I'll just jump right into it. Where can I get more detailed information and pricing on purchasing more self-checkout for my store?
Yeah, my suggestion is contact your sales representative from STCR. They can work with you to determine if you have self-checkouts today, what would be required to put more in as far as the layout goes, what will fit, won't fit. Again, you got to make sure you have the right spacing, but I would definitely work with STCR to figure out what models to make the most sense. We have a lot of different size baggers and things like that you'd want to do for your store. But I definitely follow up with STCR and get those questions answered.
All right, thanks, Paul.
Yep.
What is the best-in-class utilization rate for self-checkouts?
I like to say anything below 35%, you're probably not following best practices. Those retailers that I work with, I'll give you an example. I did a best practice training session for one of the STCR customers, and they probably had about, at the time, probably 15 stores. And when the owner brought in the 15 store managers to learn about best practices, each one of those managers knew what their self-checkout utilization was in their store. And they know that because they're measured on that, and ownership is looking at it, management is looking at it. So at least 35%. If you got under 35% of your transactions going through your self-checkout, it probably tells me the experience is not that good and the store is not serious about it, and you're probably running 18%, 20%, and you're spending a lot of money. You might as well make the investment into the resource to make sure they're operating correctly. So I would say the minimum is 35%, preferably 40, but we'll go with 35.
All right, great, thank you.
Good question.
Paul, which grocer today would you say sets the gold standard for self-checkout usage?
Wegmans does a great job, and I'll preface it with this. It's a per store basis, right? Because I know the Wegmans by me, I live in Wake Forest, they do a phenomenal job. They have 2 banks of 6 self-checkouts, if I remember right. They have a total of 12, and I think they have a shopper assistant assigned to each of those 6 lanes. So 2 shopper assistants. So I think Wegmans does a great job. They're all about customer service. They follow best practices really well. So they would be probably one of the gold standards. I can tell you a lot of grocers that do a terrible job at it. but we won't get into that here. But yeah, I think those that understand the purpose of the shopper assistant and they know how to pick the right one probably have the best success when management's engaged as well and making sure they're all understanding the purpose behind it. So that'd be my answer. Yep.
Great. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Have you seen success or data to back the success of personal video monitors in preventing theft in the supermarket?
No, we don't. I don't think I've ever seen a report that says if you do the personal video monitor, your shrink's going to go down to that. But I will tell you, when I'm at the stores and I'm working with the retailers, those retailers that have adopted some type of personal video monitor or some type of surveillance in the self-checkout area have much better results, right? Because we always see it, well, recording in process. Is it probably recording? Probably not. But I think when you look at shrink, right, the majority of the shoppers aren't there to steal from you, especially at the front end. But if you put enough roadblocks in their way to steal, they're not going to steal. So again, shopper assistant talking to them, videos showing their face on the screen or close proximity, right? If you put enough in that area, they're probably not going to steal from you at the self-checkout lane. So again, it's a piece of the puzzle, but it's not the puzzle itself.
Okay.
All right.
Last question, Paul. What is the timeline of availability for the loss prevention solutions that you showcased today?
So Produce Rec is available. If you're running TCX Sky, we just released version 1.3 for TCX Sky. So that is available today. If you're running Windows, so let's say Lock SMS, our target to have version 1.3 released is next month. And I preface 1.3 because we made several changes with the way it runs in the store. It's a lot lighter in the store than it was before. So I always recommend going to version 1.3. The overhead loss prevention solution that was released in the middle of December. So that is available today. We're still going through a little bumps as far as the ordering process for that with our channel. We're working on that hard to get that released. But there's no reason why you can't start looking at the overhead loss prevention piece as well. So those two are available. Just keep in mind on the overhead, it's the first use case, and that is catching misscans / ghost scans where people are not scanning at the scanner scale themselves. They're trying to fake it out. That's kind of the first use case for that one, and then there's more to come after that.
All right, fantastic. So that's a wrap, Paul. Thank you very much for today's session. I want to thank everyone who joined today. I also want to give a quick plug. Please feel free to join us for next month for our next installation of the Self-Checkout Monthly Mastery Series. That's going to be on March 7th. And for that session, we're going to be tackling why self-checkout. So that'll be more geared toward retailers who have not yet made the plunge into investing in self-checkout. Also, one more plug. Later this month, we're going to be hosting our monthly Lunch and Learn series. That's going to take place on Thursday, February 29th at 1 p.m. And that session is going to be focused on eSuite navigation, which is the latest user interface and reporting tool available from the Lock SMS system. So feel free to tune into that. And I want to thank everyone again for your time this afternoon. And thank you as always, Paul, for today's session.
All right, y'all take care. Thank you.
All right, have a good one, guys. Thank you.
Bye.